Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Abby Lester. I am the director of the JDC Global Archives, and welcome to today's special lecture by Katarina Kralova in honor of International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Our program today is co-sponsored by the Jewish Museum of Greece and is made possible by the generous support of the Miriam Mimi Pasternak Tobin Public Educational Programming from the JDC Archives. Before we start today's program, I'd like to share a few words about the archives. We hold the organizational history of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, or JDC or the Joint, including millions of documents, hundreds of thousands of photographs, hundreds of artifacts, as well as audio, video, and film recordings dating back to the founding of the organization in 1914. Given the role that JDC has played in Jewish lives around the world since 1914, our archives reflect not only the history of the organization, but also the history of world Jewry in the 20th and 21st centuries. In fact, we are regarded as one of the most important archives for the study of modern Jewish history. Operating out of both New York and Jerusalem, visiting scholars from around the world utilize our unique offerings for their research, as do publishers, genealogists, journalists, curators, filmmakers, and others. To support scholarly research in our collections, we also offer fellowships funded by generous donors. Our speaker today, Katarina Kralova, is Professor of Contemporary History and head of the Research Center for Memory Studies, the Institute of International Studies at Charles University in Prague. Her work focuses on coming to terms with the Nazi past, the Holocaust, the Greek Civil War, conflict-related migration, and post-war reconstruction. Dr. Králová is a graduate of Philipps University Marburg. She has been awarded major international fellowships, including the Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship, the Wiesenthal Institute Vienna Fellowship, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Fellowship, and the Fulbright Fellowship at Yale University. She is the author of Das Vermächtnis der Besatzung, a book on Greek-German relations since the 1940s, and numerous articles and edited collections in Czech, English, German, and Greek. Today, she will present her new book, Homecoming: Holocaust Survivors and Greece, 1941 to 1946, which will be published in April by Brandeis University Press. Dr. Králová will present for about 45 minutes, followed by 15 minutes or so of Q&A. Please note that your microphones are turned off, and we will take questions via the Q&A function. You can send us questions at any time during the program. And Katarina Kralova will now start her lecture.
Thank you, Abby, for the very kind introduction. Thank you all for being here. It's so beautiful to see so many names which somehow accompanied me through the path of the writing process, of the research, and of everything I have done in the past more than a decade on writing this book. It is my great pleasure and honor to have the first online lecture in English for Joint Distribution Committee archives, because as you will see, this was one of my major sources, very interesting one, seeing Greece and the survivors and survivorship and reconstruction from a different perspective than the communities themselves. And having a wonderfully organized archive, which is available online. And for me, as an outsider from Greece and also from the United States, that was a unique chance to do my research partly from at home. But of course, as it was said, it's not only a homework that I was doing, it was also going through archives in several countries, seeing people getting reflections, discussing with survivors still around and with their families. And I'm so glad you were with us today. Please allow me now to share my screen, and I will guide you through what is the presentation of today. Well, what you are seeing on the screen is the cover of the book, which will be published with Brandeis University Press this April. And even that work, the wonderful art piece by Artemis Alkali, herself a second generation of survivors in Greece, is something which connects my writing and what is around us. Since there could be many photographs, but those photographs will always avoid someone of your beloved ones, of those who perished, who were murdered, and those who survived. For my book, I decided not to add photographs and let you just imagine the full story through the writing I was doing. You will though see many maps, as you will see today at the presentation, which I will guide you through. First, I will discuss a little bit the methodologies that I used and where I got my inspiration for what I was doing throughout the many years. And then I will bring you closer into the structure of my book while first elaborating on some facts about Greece and Jews in Greece, which may be familiar to many of you, as I saw many names which uh, relate absolutely to the Jewish community of Greece or of people who are of Greek origin. But I can imagine for many listeners here, Greece is a country which we usually relate with what we have learned in our school books, and that's mostly antiquity. And that's where maybe my fascination with Greece started, that I didn't know nothing more than the pillars of Athens and Acropolis. And when I came to the story of the Jews of Greece, it became fascinating for me. Being myself of Jewish origin from Central Europe, uh, taking a better glimpse on what was happening in Greece, made me to understand and to deal with relations which all those countries throughout Europe, which were occupied by Nazi Germany and maybe more countries, and where the Jewish communities were completely or nearly completely destroyed, shared together. So let's move in our presentation. At the very end of the presentation, I will elaborate on the obstacles I have during my studies and research, and you will see some examples from archives, from the vast archives and interviews that I have been dealing with. So please bear with me, and I hope it will be interesting for all of you. Let me change the slide. Yes, it's working. Always technologies and not seeing you all is also something I'm not that much used to. I would love to have you all around and see your faces as well. But let's speak a little bit about what I tried to do. Of course, I am a historian, but what I deal with is only a contemporary history, in fact. But dealing with one country and one, so to say, community, even there were many, as we will see throughout the presentation, it's always about transnational history as well, about all those transnational ties, about all those countries the survivors went to, or those who wanted to survive life tried to go to, where they had families, where they had professional relations, where they managed to go, or unfortunately not. Uh, I had to deal not only with archives, of course, but to get the story of the everyday life. What was most interesting was reading the memoirs and going into personal accounts of those who survived, but also them, they were speaking about those who perished. So the tension between those murdered and those who survived, how they dealt with it, was part of what I was doing, and that very much relates to memory studies. I spoke already about the fact that my book is, in fact, a case study. However, in this case study, it was very much needed that I take an inspiration and I compare it, at least in my head, with many other countries which other scholars have written about and see how it relates. And of course, when the writing process started, and that was back in 2014-15, when I was a USHMM visiting scholar and fellow, I realized that there is so many things where people are forced to migrate and flee their countries. That was in the middle of the refugee crisis. And I was thinking about the case of the Jews of Greece and of many other countries who were trying the same, and many of them did not succeed. So it all relates together. It's not just history, it's much more approaches which I tried to consider, and there were many people who helped me on the way. It wouldn't be without Leon Saltiel and Rena Molko and Rika Benveniste, who introduced me about 2 decades ago to Greece and to the Jewish communities of Greece. All of them come from Thessaloniki, where the major community of Greece was living until the deportations. And Thessaloniki, in their research, played a major role. And I myself, from a family not from Prague, from a little town where there was hardly a Jewish community, just a few Jewish families. So I was asking myself, how did it look elsewhere in Greece? What about the other cities? And how did people manage to survive over there? And what was their fate? What was it all in Greece beyond Thessaloniki? In that way, of course, I took inspiration not only from historians, but from anthropologists who wrote her PhD thesis again on Thessaloniki, but using other methodologies than the three before, and that was Bea Levkovitz. Bea Levkovitz has a similar background with me, in fact, because her family, her mother, was from Czechoslovakia. Exchanging those perspectives was something amazing, and I will always have Bea very deep in my heart. And then it comes to other stories of the full Greece and of the Jewish communities in Greece and Holocaust in Greece. And with Catherine Fleming and her perspective on Greece, I got a new incentive to do my research on this very specific topic. But there is also before the Holocaust. And in that sense, the book on Thessaloniki by Devin Nair inspired me extensively to understand how a country which developed from the Ottoman Empire, not like mine from the Habsburg Empire, was facing and dealing with its own Jewish communities, and how the Jewish communities established themselves in a new country which was sort of similar to those little countries on the map, on the territory of Habsburg Empire, and yet so different because of the Ottoman heritage. Uh, for sources, Sarah Abravanel-Stein opened my eyes in a completely new direction, how she communicated a single family history, which was so transnational, going far beyond Greece and even the Ottoman Empire. But since I spoke before that about the conceptual framings and about methodologies, I had to dig deeper. Greece wasn't enough. And I had some people which inspired me, even though I never met them in person because they already passed away, such as Reinhard Koselleck, and his imagination of conceptual history, his conceptual framing of our expectations and the horizon of expectations, which inspired me for the expectations of those who will be a survivor, but also of those who won't survive but would have wished to do so. This comes together with emotions, and those emotions are very aptly depicted by in the work by Uta Frevert. And of course, with psychology, where Yael Danieli did her wonderful work. And then how to see it in context of other countries. And that was people like Joanna Michlik, who did her work on Poland and on Jewish families. And also the work, an incredible piece of comparative work in Ordinary Jews, as did Eugene Finkel on territories of Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, and all those parts of wars, and about the agency that those who wished to survive put in their own acts. Throughout all those years, as I said, maybe more than a decade, because my first book already somehow suggested that there is a lot of material which I cannot handle and which I cannot put into one book if I don't wish the book to be volumes. And back then in early 2000, I started to see there must be another book about the Jews in Greece. You can see here that it was archives in Greece, but also far beyond Greece. It was also German archives that I went to and that I read through for the history of the occupation. And it was a lot of personal stories, both written and narrated by the survivors themselves. Newspapers, and not just wartime newspapers, but the newspapers after the war, which were depicting what happened before the war, during the war, and after that. To bring you closer to what was Greece during the war, let me change the slide again and go to the Nazi and not only Nazi occupation in Greece. As you may see on the map, and as you may well know as well, Greece was not occupied only by Germany. It was in triple occupation, occupied and divided in zones which were governed by Bulgaria, Italy, and Germany. Germany first, red on the screen or the map, didn't have big part of Greece, but it expanded after the Italian survivor to everything you see blue on the map. And it needs to be said that not only in the German zone, but also in the Bulgarian one, the Jews suffered and were deported and occasionally murdered in case of the Bulgarian zone to Treblinka, where nobody survived in all parts of Greece. So every community you see on the map is a community which suffered extensively. And of course, we can discuss the percentage of suffering, but the suffering which was there hit every Jewish family in Greece immensely. However, if we go fast forward and into the time after the war, we see that even the American Joint Distribution Committee, the aid giver, the major aid giver to Jews in Greece, which is now hosting our event as an institution of archives and testimonies, was was seeing Greece and commenting on Greece more as a country which suffered under starvation, military of repression, guerrilla welfare, as in the starting civil war and Cold War, the partisans, the leftist partisans of Greece were being called immense inflation and political instability. In that document, we see no words about the destruction of the Jewish communities themselves. And that is something which really triggered my interest. So, how was the state of art in Greece before the war? We have 27 communities with the largest one in Thessaloniki, and about 75,000 Jews living in Greece. But when we go in the time when the war for Greece was over, and it needs to be said that at the day today when Auschwitz was liberated, Greece as a country was already free because it was liberated in autumn 44. But the Jewish survivors hiding in Greece or fighting together with the partisans were still waiting for those who were deported to the camps to be liberated and hopefully to return. Those hopes, those expectations, to use Kozalek, were soon to be broken. You could see on the map before various trajectories of what was happening in Greece and where the Jews of Greece were about to go in hiding, to join the armed forces, to emigrate, to flee the country, or to be deported to the extermination camps. It needs to be said that in Greece, there was no Jew who would not face an forced displacement, be it an internal one or an external one. Staying at home was not an option, because if those people decided to stay at home, they would have been found and deported to the camps. So my book, as it goes, is divided sort of linearly, but also sort of to the experience group in 4 chapters mostly. The first one is on those in hiding who were also the first ones to come out of their safe harbors and to start to renegotiate how Jewish communities in Greece will be reestablished. Those people were going to different towns. Very few of them, in fact, managed to hide in Thessaloniki and stay in the city, which used to be called the Jerusalem of the Balkans, with the flourishing major Jewish community in Greece. More, and even those from Thessaloniki were going somewhere else, and the next city to go to would be Athens, the capital, which could give them some invisibility, where they could stay more anonymous and where they were hoping that nobody would recognize them if they hide their identity or if they hide as such in a place where nobody would see them. This means that the trauma of the war, which was coming to those in hidings, be it in those 2 cities or in the countryside, in the mountains, on the islands, would cause major dilemma of who I am and what of my identity I can choose once I return back. How I will deal with my own body, which maybe did not really stretch over years. How will children learn to play with other children and will create again a healthy community? They managed, many of them did, but many of them didn't because they were catched by collaborators who were not stopping of giving the Jews of Greece, as in any other country, unfortunately, across Europe, to the perpetrators. The next chapter would be about armed forces. And when I started my writing process, I was thinking that I have one particular group, and that would be the partisans. The partisans in Greece during the occupation were mostly divided in 2 groups, the leftist MLS and the Republican rightist, if you wish, royalists, later on EDIS. However, as I was going through my research, I realized there were other men who did not shy to take the weapon in their hands and be ready to fight. That was not in Greece, because in Greece it wasn't possible anymore. The Greek army was dissolved, and there was nobody they could really connect to. So they went abroad and were fighting with the armed forces, mostly British, but some were other forces as well, to keep peace and to liberate their own country. Those in resistance were spread around Greece, across Greece, as you can see in the shades on the map of Greece over here on the map. And even if, of course, those partisans had casualties as well, the survival rate of the partisans would have been far higher than in the camps. Of course, when you think about taking weapons into your hands, again, the expectation is that you are threatening your own life, and maybe because of the restrictions against leftists and partisans, you're threatening the life of your family as well. There started to be tensions among the families. What is the right thing to do? And of course, the Jewish faith doesn't really always support to fight the fight of God. So those mainly young men, but also women, although we need to say that there were not really separated units of Jewish partisans in Greece as they were, for example, in Yugoslavia, Poland, or in Ukraine and other parts of Europe. They were still fighting together or taking care for the partisans, as was often the role of the women in nursing, in catering, and also in spreading the word about the possibly new rule after the war, which would be led by the leaders of the leftist resistance. As I said, many of them survived, but many of them lost their life or were captured. And then some of them survived in prisoners of war camps with their Jewish identity being concealed, or they had to cross the sea from Africa to return to Greece. So we have a mixture of internal and external displacement, which also navigates when the people are coming back to their hometowns, to their homes, and are back on the Greek soil. Where for partisans, they were on the Greek soil all the time. For those who joined armed forces abroad, it often took much longer until whole Europe was liberated, or even after that to return back home. All of that is the part of the chapter on armed forces, both resistance and Greek armed forces in exile. When the war in Greece was over, the Joint Distribution Committee, here always quoted as JDC, was already on the ground in Europe. They were here in Europe, where I am now, much earlier. They were known throughout Europe before the war, but through the action of Nazi Germany, they needed to evacuate from countries where they were doing their services. And those services needed to go to neutral countries such as Spain or Portugal. And I just saw Marian Kaplan, one of my great mentors, also among the audience. And all of those tensions between the aid givers who were located in very specific countries, such as Turkey or as I said, Spain and Portugal. They couldn't do much about what was happening in Greece because all of them were of Jewish origin, and that's why their life was threatened. But once it was over, they were among the first to come on the ground and to offer their services again. And so it comes that Gaynor Israel Jacobson was after Italy, after a very short intermezzo in Italy as country director, placed in Greece. And later on, you wonder, again, a connection to my own country, Czechoslovakia, and after that to Hungary. This bold man was doing action in the chaos of the post-war community, which are in many ways unimaginable. Back then, they were still waiting, both the survivors and the aid givers in form of joint distribution committee or other organization, who and how many will actually return from the camps. All of those arrangements which needed to be done, all the pastoral work, all the school work which needed to be done was assisted by the Joint Distribution Committee and is very well described and regular reports coming from the institutions. The voice is there not only from those who are observing a new country, from those aid givers who made their very first experience with Greece on the ground just in those very difficult and tense years, with a looming civil war in Greece to start in 46. But they also reported about the voices of the survivors, about how they act, how they recreate their communities, who is in what position of the community, how the survivors of Thessaloniki and other communities are acting together, what languages they are using, and they're mapping very much how the traditionally French-speaking milieu of the Balkans is somehow switching into English because of the operations on the ground where they needed to communicate with their aid givers. All of that, but also the tension between Greece and the traditional Judeo-Spanish is monitored through the incredible archive of the Joint Distribution Committee. I will speak a little bit more about Joint Distribution Committee archives later on, so bear with me for the second part of my book, the next two chapters, which are depicting those coming back to the country only after JDC was already acting there and everybody was in full expectations if their loved ones will ever come back. And the situation was much harder than anybody could imagine. For those who went first through the forced labor camps in Greece and through the transit camps and prisons such as Haidari in Athens or Pavlos Melas in Thessaloniki and many others, we could go to Larissa and other places as well, but the time is not allowing us at this moment to go into details. They were deported mainly to free camps. As I said, from Bulgarian zone, everybody was deported from to Treblinka, and the expectations of those very few who managed to hide or who were recruited only for the forced labor in Bulgaria, they didn't meet any one of their families. Very similar situation, unfortunately, was for those over 50,000 deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau, of whom about 2,000 only survived. A little bit better, but very difficult situation was about the Bergen-Belsen, where people with neutral citizenship were deported, and also the representatives of the Jewish community, of the prominent Jewish community in Thessaloniki. Their life was nothing compared to what they used to live in Greece, even in the times of deep famine which hit Greece during the war. And then we have the few of them who went through the prisoners of war camps or migration camps, and all of them are again depicted with all their very difficult and entangled trajectories in this very big chapter, concentrating more on Treblinka, Auschwitz, and Bergen-Belsen. You can see on the map again that mapping those trajectories was very difficult, and we are covering most of Europe only with those returning back to Greece from the camps. Which leaves us with the last group, and also with those who were usually the last to return back to Greece. One would wonder how it comes, but because of the politics of identity and of citizenship of the winners of the war, it was very hard to return to Greece from another country. And needless to say, the countries in the most closest proximity were often reluctant to accept anyone. Sometimes through Albania, some Jews have managed to transit to Italy, or through Turkey to transit to the British Mandate of Palestine, which in fact became the main country of those over 3,000 who survived by fleeing their own home country, Greece. Again, all of that is in the last chapter we are speaking about. How did they establish what led them to come back is something they speak pretty extensively about in the archives, which recorded their voices after the war. But if we say after the war, this doesn't mean immediately after the war, but decades later. So the perspective comes a lot with the memory, which has been tweaked and shaped by experiences they had for all the decades after the war, until the first interviewers from Fortunov Archive or from USC Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive came to them early or very early in the late 80s, but more probably in the 90s. So we see that all the life trajectories are being explained and renegotiated with everything those people experience, not only in Greece, but also in the countries they emigrated to. And it wouldn't be only personal histories. And as I said already, one of the most interesting and important things for a historian is to connect the voice to a document. Of course, I went through the Jewish community documentation and archive, through the state archives and through the Nazi archive. But today, I want to pay a tribute to the incredible work of the JDC archives, which I first discovered when being a Fulbright Fellow at the Yale University and going regularly to New York City. Back then, I was still working with microfiches and taking a look and taking some shady photographs of what would be my next work. Few years later, thanks to the good advice of the JDC archivist Misha Mitzel, I was able to decode much more effectively everything what was on the digitalized archive on the website. You see here that with the word Greece, for the folders on Greece, I came to over 800 documents, and the document is hardly ever one single page. It took several years, and then you understand why I was doing my research for such a long time, to go through the material, to sort it into my chapters, and to create a book. Greece is not enough, because mentioning of Greece was in many other contexts. So, for example, in a folder on Germany, you can find very valuable information on Greece. And that's what I was doing in the next step. As for the Visual History Archive and those many interviews of the Jewish survivors of Greece, I was also facing some challenges. I had 32 locations and 11 languages, of which I did not master all of them, although I was able to work in 6 languages in that very archive. Today, maybe I would work differently. Maybe I would ask AI to decode some of the interviews for me. Back then, I was working just by listening and taking notes. And yet, not all of those born in Greece were the only Jews of Greece, which I wanted to listen to them. And not only those who were recorded in Greece. I really wanted to incorporate the story of those who returned to Greece but then decided to go elsewhere and delivered their testimony in other country. And you can see it's half over here. But still you have the empires and the legacy of empires I was speaking about. So I had to go through the interviews of those of Ottoman Empire born in Thessaloniki, Kavala, and many other communities. Still, I didn't notice all of them, and I am pretty sure I still missed some of them because, as you could see, you can see there were people who were born in Yugoslavia, Egypt, on the islands, which only became part of Greece after the war, or even my own home country, Czechoslovakia. So to give you a better glimpse on those challenges, you see that Sultana Levi was born in Bodrum, Turkey. Country of birth was Ottoman Empire. She went through ghettos where some of them are in some sources not described as ghettos or camps, and that would be Haidari in Greece. This is the first mentioning of Greece in the metadata on her own testimony. And the interview location was in South Africa, and the language was English. So I had very little hints that I should go to interviews like that. And that's why time was needed, and time was very useful. Let me give you one more example of one family, which is the one related to Czechoslovakia. Of course, when I first came for research to Greece in 1999, I didn't expect that at all. But after everybody knew there is a Czech historian interested in the World War II history of Greece and Jews of Greece, I was always being spoken to about the Cuneo family. Cuneo family is a specific case of 4 survivors, mother, father, daughter, and son. All of them survived Auschwitz. But the father of Helen, who was a German Jew of Czechoslovakia, was also deported and wasn't that lucky and never returned back from Auschwitz. When I want to go to the interviews and to the sources on the Cuneo family, I had 2 prominent survivors, the young ones, because the parents already passed away when I started to do my research. And that was Erika and Heinz. But then you have memoirs which are written in several languages, adjusted for the audience in each language. So if you read one book, it doesn't mean you get the perfectly same story with the translation, because this translation is also being done by the family themselves who were multilingual and adjusted for English speaking or German speaking and audience, which otherwise wouldn't really understand all of the realities of Greece. And then you have the multiple archives where you can find more material on them, and you dig in it, go into it, and until you get the full story of one single family. In my book, I'm covering about 1,000 testimonies and about 100 survivor families. And I am sorry if I miss any of you. We'll be happy to hear back from you and discuss more on it. Fortunately, there is a meta database created by my wonderful colleagues in Greece, headed back then by Rika Benveniste, who did amazing work in putting together many of the testimonies given by the survivors, many of the memoirs they have written, and a short depiction or description of their lives. But of course, you are missing a lot of data. from that description on Erika Amarillo Cuneo, you would never guess that she or her mother is actually from Czechoslovakia. But it's not only the archives and the documents of the post-war placed in the Joint Distribution Committee archive and in the testimonies. Many of them are today accessible either directly or under password online. But only in putting them all together, we can get closer to the reality of what was happening after the war was over. And that is my last chapter in my book, taking a closer look on the ground and seeing what is in fact happening in those cities and what is triggering and how it's being narrated after decades have passed and how it was reflected immediately in the post-war period. One anecdote is about the candlelight of Thessaloniki, one of the only artifacts which remained to the community and remained not for free. If the narrator of Bea Lefkowitz, whom she interviewed and published in her book on Thessaloniki in 2006, is saying a story which suggests that the chandelier was saved by the Orthodox Church of Greece, the historical documentation is giving us another story. It wasn't as altruistic as the interview, which is commemorating the act after the many decades is showing. And yet, the representative of the Joint Distribution Committee, Kane Jacobson, before leaving, is giving us a much rawer story on this history, how they needed to negotiate and how they needed to buy out the artifacts, which in fact were stolen or appropriated by the non-Jews. Again, this story would have its mirror anywhere else in Europe and in the post-World War II countries where the Jewish communities were destroyed. But it gives us a glimpse of thinking how we deal with the history and how we deal with the sources we are using and how much we need to check and double check on how we understand the memory and how we understand the historical facts and documents which we are dealing with. With that, I will finish my talk for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Katerina. And thank you for your enthusiasm about your work with the archives in general, and particularly with JDC's archives. It's great to hear. I'm glad the archives were such an important part of your research. I hope everybody has found the program today as interesting as I have, and thank you for joining us. I also want to thank the Jewish Museum of Greece for co-sponsoring the lecture, and the Miriam Mimi Pasternak-Tubin Public Educational Programming from the JDC Archives, which made this webinar possible. Our next webinar will take place on February 10th. Alexandra Yakubchak, recipient of the Sorel and Lorraine Chesson JDC Archives Fellowship for 2024, will give a lecture on Jewish women facing the Great War on the Eastern Homefront. You can register for it via our Facebook page or our website, and please feel free to sign up for our e-newsletter if you would like to be added to our mailing list for upcoming public programs. Thank you again, Katerina. It was wonderful to hear from you, and thank you for sharing your important work.